Okay, so now we have a panel with the modest title, The Future of the International System. And we have an hour and 15 minutes to fix it, to respond. So that's an ambitious undertaking. I'm very grateful to all the panelists. You have the booklet, so where you find their bios, so I won't make any long introduction. But I think we should start momentarily because, as I said, it's 10:30 at night in Beijing. And so we're grateful to Professor Yu for being with us at this late hour. These are definitely not working hours. I will start with, I will start by asking each of you what you make of this new situation. And during the week, we have been looking at a variety of disruptions, the political disruption brought on by the American election, the technological disruption that are ongoing. So the ground is shifting under us. And so how do we deal with that is really a question that we need to address. And so maybe Elizabeth, who is the president of the UN Foundation, who has worked at the United Nations, who is very much, engaged with multilateralism. You're actually evolving the role of the UN Foundation, but what is the state of play as you see it today, and what can be done? Because this morning we're trying to begin to finance it.
Well, thank you. Is this on for all of you?
You have to push the button.
That's a really critical operational thing to know. Well, thank you, Jean-Marie. First of all, it's really a pleasure to be here. I'm looking really forward to discussion with this panel, but also with all of you in the room. So asking about where things are going, particularly in and around the UN, in a room full of people who know the institution exceptionally well, I think is an opportunity for a very, very rich debate. So a few thoughts. First, I think if anyone tells you they know what the future holds, you have to be very skeptical. I think we can only view these times as a truly open moment. You know, what Antonio Gramsci described as an interregnum between an order that we all knew and were schooled in, grew up with, and one that has yet to settle. And there are very different pathways that are equally plausible in an environment that's this dynamic and this open. Second point, virtually every institution, whether it's our governments, our media, or of course the United Nations, is struggling to adapt in such a dynamic time. You know, institutions don't generally move very fast, and these are very fast-moving times. And what's usually a strength of institutions, their stability, the kind of parameters that they provide around norms and expectations of behavior, under these conditions, that can become a liability. And I think you see that playing out in a lot of spheres, including the UN. So let's come to the United Nations, which is the institution I have always worked in and around my entire life, and in which I believe deeply, as I imagine you do too. So this has been an exceptionally disruptive year, that's no secret. But well before the United States began its forced march of essentially breaking up with, or maybe just breaking the international order as we know it. We can unpack that in many ways. The United Nations and the wider multilateral system was widely recognized to need urgent, deep, and broad-based reform. It's an 80-year-old institution. It needed to be modernized. It needed to be modernized to deal with new threats, whether it's AI or climate change or others. It definitely needs new fiscal models. You all know better than I do. So many agencies of the UN system are 80 to 90% dependent on project financing. That has not been sustainable for a long time. And they especially have needed to be modernized to reflect changing power dynamics in the world, which have comprehensively changed, but the institution hasn't yet changed with it. And Secretary General Guterres, one of my favorite quotes of his is, "You can't have a system and a future fit for our grandchildren relying on an institution that was built by your grandparents." And I think that remains very true. So all of those factors have produced just a profound crisis at and around the United Nations that cannot be underestimated. But saying that and recognizing, and you all know this, if you work in and around the UN, you see the kind of the depth and frankly despair of a lot of colleagues, especially those who work in humanitarian agencies who see and health areas where they see the immediate impacts of cost cuts and just the pressures on the UN system playing out in lives and livelihoods around the world. At the same time, the severity and the totality of that disruption has actually produced an openness that I think we have long needed for much more ambitious change. It's very clear that there, to my observation at any rate, there is no going back to a status quo ante. This isn't about restoring aid flows. It isn't about kind of patching back together the institutions we've all known and grown up with. It is very much about figuring out how we go forward. And I think there is a real opportunity within the membership, many of the delegations you represent across the Secretariat, and with constituencies more broadly who believe in and understand how much they need an international system that works to seize this moment in a kind of generative act of, I can't say new creation. This isn't a San Francisco moment. The conditions are clearly not there for that, but to begin to put in place the building blocks of a system that will genuinely reflect the needs and interests of the future, genuinely reflect new forms of problem solving, and begin to put in place a more durable political base of support for what that looks like. So I keep thinking, without being overly impolite, this is not a moment where you rearrange deck chairs. This is not a moment where you debate how many pillars or clusters the UN has or which ones are on top. You have to do all of that. And you, of course, have to figure out what are the most affordable locations to have different parts of the UN system. All those need attention. But the bigger opportunity is to begin to think together across regions, across constituencies, about a vision for the future of the UN, about what we need from this institution at this moment in time. I mean, its founding purpose was clarion. I go back to reading the UN Charter not infrequently. It's partly because I'm a bit of a UN geek, but also because it's really inspiring to think about the conditions that produced that agreement. And it wasn't a sentimental one, right? It was very much based on power. It was built by the victors of the Second World War in joining others along the way. So we can't, be sentimental about it. But thinking about in our moment, we don't want to have another crisis. We are already in the midst of manifold crises of multiple kinds, overlapping in ways that affect all of our citizens and communities. We don't need something even bigger and darker to prompt us into doing something better. So that's kind of where I approach this moment, why I get excited about things like the ideas in Stephen's paper and others that are really trying to reimagine what it is we need. And you tell me when we get into conversation, but I think there is energy and appetite across the membership of the UN for some of that. Even if we don't all agree about what the answer is, that's what we need to be debating. So I will leave it at that, Jean-Marie, for my opening reflections, and look forward to hearing.
Thank you very much. And as you just noted, I mean, the UN was built recognizing the notion of power. It was, in that sense, a structure that was different from the League of Nations, and the idea of the Security Council as a small body that would concentrate power and focus the organization was very much in the minds of the drafters in 1945. So speaking of power today, as the United States takes a leave in a way from engaging with multilateral organizations, so we look at power centers around the world. We immediately think about China, obviously. We think of Europe, but only up to a point, because Europe has wields considerable power when it comes to the competencies of the European Commission on trade and on a number of economic issues. But Europe does not have certainly the hard power of, let's say, that China or certainly the United States have. So maybe I'll turn to Professor Tiejun Yu, and as you look at the future of the international system, at the role of multilateralism in this future, how do you see China taking on that issue?
Can you hear me?
Very well.
Oh, great. Thank you, Professor Guéhenno, for inviting me here. I had thought I was at on the name list, I was the last and prepared for the last one to speak. But now, of course, China now is always also talking about international order, you know, and also the polarization issues. You know, the catchword here to describe the situation at the current stage, the world affairs is a kind of it's an era full of change and turbulence. So the deficit in peace, development, security, and governance are growing, and the world is once again at a crossroad in history that is unprecedented. That's some of the key sentences in China's CPC's, National Party Congress report to describe the characteristic of the current situation. So how to deal with that? China, I know there are many discussion, especially in the United States and also in Europe, that China was regarded as a revisionist, not fully abide by the rule-based so-called international order, liberal. But it seems to me China actually we want to be a stabilizer of the current international order with the United Nations at its cause. And this year is the 80th anniversary of its foundation, and we are celebrating that. And also, China has now contributed to about 20% of the budget of the United Nations, and also to the peacekeeping missions of the United Nations. And China is, I think, quite different with regard to the international order from, say, Russia. It's kind of for that kind of purpose, China has put forward, we call it the three initiatives. The three global initiatives, global development initiatives, global security initiatives, and civilization initiatives, to try to build up a kind of polarization of equitable and orderly, and also a kind of globalization that is universally profitable, and that's a kind of globalization. I think that's China's official, point of views on international system now. It's with the UN as its core, and also the international law represented by the UN charters and principles as the basis for the global governance. That's my I think my take.
Thank you very much. Pascal Lamy, so you were instrumental working with Jacques Delors at a time when the European Union transformed itself, built itself. You have been a European Commissioner, you have been the head of the World Trade Organization. And so now there's a big question on, well, the World Trade Organization is certainly in a bit of a crisis, and multilateral organization in general are in some trouble. As a committed European, what do you see that can be done and should be done? How do you assess the situation?
Thanks, Jean-Marie, and good to see you on this very important topic all. 4 short points seen from the European point of view. Number one, this is not that bad. When you look at what's happened for, let's say, the last 2 years or 2.5 years, we've had a Kunming-Montreal agreement on biodiversity. We've had a BBNG on protecting the high sea. We've had a decarbonation important agreement at the International Maritime Organization. And we've had a agreement in the World Health Organization on pandemics. Now, I'm not saying all this is absolutely fine, but still, the system is still producing agreements. And I think it's fair to say that alternatives like informal groupings like the G20, for instance, that had gathered some hope when they were created, do not do better. So there is no way, TNA, there is no alternative. Second point, I think, rather than trying to fix the old, it would be preferable to build the new and show that we still are capable of constructing together a number of global public goods which we need. I'll give you one example because I'm speaking to you from this Nice UN Ocean Conference. So it's a very topical topic in a way. We Europeans have taken the lead in trying to build a digital twin of the ocean in order to fill the gap, the huge science and knowledge gap that we have. This is a major collective endeavor because we need that in order to take the necessary action to stop and reverse the ocean degradation. We need a global agreement on cleaning the lower orbit of the Earth. We need a global agreement on a minimum of security and safety for submarine cables or satellite stations. We need a minimum of global agreement on AI principles. So there's a lot there which I believe we should prioritize. Of course, understanding, and that's the big new thing, that some of that will have to be done without the US for the moment, without the US as part of the agreement, or without the US as funding, bringing the necessary funding. So this is a new situation. You mentioned, Jean-Marie, the WTO. Yes, the US have de facto left the WTO, and the WTO has to learn how to work without the US. Third and before last point, there is one priority, I think, in the building of these global public goods is to fix the climate governance deficit, which we have created with the Paris Agreement. I'm a big fan of the Paris Agreement, but let's be frank, in a small circle, the Paris Agreement is a big regression in international governance and in international institutions because it is based on nationally determined contributions and not on multinationally determined contributions. Global institutions must be based on multinationally determined contributions and principles and not on nationally determined principles. Last point, I know that in the previous episodes of this cycle, Jean-Marie, you've been dealing with the sort of bottom-up part of international cooperation and governance. I think the most efficient way to move forward for the moment is what I've called polylateralism, which is the principle on which the Paris Peace Forum was born, which is a combination of sovereigns, some of them, a few diplomats, but NGOs, large academic institutions, big non-sovereign public actors like cities or regions. I think for the moment, this is the way to go. And what we've done with the Paris Peace Forum since it was created in 2008, I think is a sort of proof of concept which we should learn from. Over to you.
For these very clear directions that you give us. Now I'm going to turn to Kyung-wha Kang. Kyung-wha Kang, we are all the colleagues at the United Nations, and that she is a very distinguished Korean diplomat. She's the foreign minister of Korea. And I think it would be very interesting to hear from you. I mean, coming from a very dynamic middle power in Asia, a place, a continent where there's no strong regional organization. There is no actually a regional organization. How in this new world, where when you have Korea as a global reach and Korea is interested in managing globalization, how do you see it in this new world, and how do powers like Korea can contribute to structuring this world?
Thank you very much, Jean-Marie, for having me. I've been in New York, back in New York for over a year, and wonderful to come back and be a part of discussion that Jean-Marie's put together. You are all aspiring diplomats, and I think my first their career, and I think this is a moment of huge disruption, as we all agree, and it's really important for the practitioner of that craft, diplomacy, to really understand what that means. And at the end, it means, for me, it's making sure you work for peace. I mean, it sounds stale, it sounds so plain, but at the end, that is our craft. And I see this folding out every day as foreign minister, now in Asian society, dealing with all kinds of Asian governments, but every moment of encounter between governments or officials or civil society actors from other countries, there is that moment of clash, of discord. And as diplomats, we really need to be mindful that our work is to work through that discord towards maybe not solution, but at least management of that discord so that it doesn't get out of hand. We live in a world where it really is easy for things to get out of hand, to lead to larger discords, larger disagreements, and perhaps even verbal public confrontation, and even military confrontation. And this is even more true because we live in a world of strong leaders, macho leaders who do diplomacy on Twitter. Diplomacy as we knew it in the old days, where you work, analyze the issue, you work through your government's positioning, and it made it way up to the top level. This is not, today, it's almost the other way around. The political will of the top leader is announced first, and then you have to make sure that what you do is in accord, but in a way at the fundamental level that resolves and manages and works toward peace. And I think you probably face that all the time at the UN in the basement negotiation rooms and crafting your diplomatic messages. Of course, you can't digress too far away from your existing positions, but you do have that margin at wherever you are to work towards strengthening that element for understanding and resolution, and not the other way. Yes, the ROK is an interesting country. It's my own country. But having been at the UN for 10 years, looking at my country from that global stage, and now at Asia Society, looking at my country from a rising Asia perspective, it's an oddity. It's an exceptional country. It's in many ways. So for example, just this week, we've had a presidential election, the result of which was a repudiation of another strong man who was divisive, who sowed hostility, who demonized his own, the opposition, and no sense of bringing unity to the country. The result was a repudiation of that. We now have a president who is committed to bringing the unity back. And I don't see strong leaders, working for national unity anymore in all of our democracies. So that's a bit of an exception. It doesn't mean that division isn't deep. The division is really, really deep. 41% of the public voted for the candidate whose continuation was that. So it has a challenge, but the result this week has been a good one for South Korea's democracy, and I think democracies around the world. It is also an oddity in the sense that it's the biggest beneficiary of the order that has existed. The liberal, open international order that the United States has led to create has led in preserving, and Korea really benefited from that. Under that system of openness, the economy grew. We're now the 10th or 11th largest economy. We achieved democratization, so now citizens are guaranteed the full spectrum of freedom and rights. And it's very rare for a country that was completely devastated by civil war in 1950 to come from that to what it is now. So we're always touted as a model, right? An exception. And that is all good. And I think, but it's very difficult to find another model. So it's a model. It's a wonderful product of the system that has existed, but it's an exception, I think. The second oddity is we live in, South Korea is in Northeast Asia, as Jean-Marie says, a geopolitical region that has no mechanism or even habit of regional cooperation. And there's a reason for that. The history is very, very difficult. The countries around the region has evolved in different tracks because South Korea has become a vibrant democracy. China, increasingly economically powerful, but I think the political system is more towards controlling and authoritarianism. Russia, we don't even need to speak about that. And Japan is also a democracy, but a very different kind of democracy where I think civil society activism is very dampened compared to what we see in South Korea. Then, of course, we have North Korea, right? The biggest challenge to nuclear non-proliferation for the whole of the global community. And in this community, Korea has survived and has become this economic, technical powerhouse and a thriving democracy. So it's an oddity. So, that oddity was brought home to me at the Munich Security Conference. I think it was 2020, right? Feb 20, my final one, when the whole title of that conference was Westlessness. Remember that? Yeah, the Munich Security Council is about the transatlantic alliance. That's its origin, but it has over the years brought in other voices from other parts of the world, South Korean foreign minister, the Chinese foreign minister. So we were all there, but there was this self-navel gazing about how the West was losing it. And it was so myopic and without consideration of how those Western values have really rooted in other parts of the world, such as South Korea. So where is South Korea? Are we West or non-West? Or so that was a very revealing moment of how out on a limb or exception or South Korea is, and how important it was, therefore, to South Korea to preserve its national self-identity as a market economy and a free democracy, and how challenging that is, and how challenging it is going to be in the future. But now that order is unraveling, huge disruption. Some call it a paradigm shift. Some call it a revolutionary change. However you count it, it's changing. And so the need to adapt to that change, of course, is going to be the most difficult for a country like Korea that has hugely invested and hugely benefited from that system. But I don't think the disruption began with T2, 6 months, no. I think the Biden 4 years was a temporary halt. The T1 was also not the beginning. I trace that back to actually the Bush administration, George W. Bush. I think the unilateral, attack on Iraq on baseless, evidence about the WMDs there. It was a revealing moment, but I think the whole approach of that administration, and I remember this thing is some thought linkers that are driving the policy agenda saying, we create reality, right? And you, the rest of the world, you follow. A clearly unilateral approach to global affairs that I think was probably the start of the unraveling of a multilateral global order that the United States has always led. So what does a country like Korea do? I think in the first instance, we really need to preserve our national identity as a market economy and a free democracy, do our very best to shore up the multilateral system. It's not going to go away. It will stay. The UN will be around in whatever form. And a country like South Korea that has hugely benefited must do everything it can to be a part of the shoring up of that multilateral system. And I hope the new government gets that point. And then, if the multilateral collaborative system is fraying, then of course there is a greater need for regional cooperation to step in. Other regions have already established mechanisms and institutions to do that. There's none in Northeast Asia. There have been attempts in the past, whether it's 6 countries or just among the 3 countries. And there, you could have a series of big conversations and you start to see that habit of regional cooperation growing, then it stops. And it starts and spurts in Northeast Asia. And I would strongly argue for the countries of the region to make an extra push for regional cooperation in the region, whether it's just Korea, Japan, and China, or to include other Mongolia and other countries in the region. It's hard. I know we've tried. It's really hard but in the instance, you need to grow that habit of collaboration. I think the Chinese government is very keen to do that. And I'm hoping that the new South Korean government will also be very keen to move in that direction. So let me just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're beginning to see some light with Pascal and then with you on how to not repair, but transform the system. Stephen Heintz, you've been the president of a very, creative, I would say, foundation, which does a lot of interesting things, including supporting track 2 negotiations and a variety of things a bit under the radar that are extremely helpful. And you recently, in a way, that's not typical of the foundation, you published a report, Logic of the Future, which is both, a very broad, it gives a very broad perspective, and at the same time is very practical in how to deal with this new international system. So I thought you should have the last word in this first round of discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Jean-Marie. It's very kind of you to give me the last word, although it's a huge challenge to follow the other distinguished speakers on this panel. Let me start by saying how delighted I am to be with all of you. I think the work that you're doing, the careers that you're in the midst of pursuing are extremely important, and they don't get recognized enough. Diplomacy is no longer valued in the way that it ought to be, and that's one of the things that I stress in this paper. I think Jean-Marie sent you a link to this, but I've brought hard copies, which are here on the front table, and I urge you to take them so I don't have to carry them back. I will start in a way that kind of perhaps summarizes some of the themes that you've heard from our other colleagues on the panel. We are clearly living in an age of unprecedented turbulence. I mean, the evidence is just all around us. There are 184 violent conflicts raging around the world. It's the largest number in 3 decades. We have a kind of situation of escalating great power competition with a very serious risk that it could create great power confrontation. We have the accelerating climate crisis, which is causing real-time loss of life, physical and economic devastation, and turbocharging the mass movement of people around the world. Political polarization is crippling many of the world's advanced democracies, and authoritarianism, or at least authoritarian impulses, are on the rise. And in a time of growing need for public sector services and investment, debt levels across the globe are at unprecedented levels. And now, of course, there is a new and deeply troubling source of turbulence, much of it intentional, in the actions, policies, and pronouncements of the Trump administration. Now, of course, history is often told as a story of turbulence, and there have been enormously turbulent times in global history. But what distinguishes this period, in my mind, is the dynamic confluence of forces, all operating at the same time: political, geostrategic, economic, social, technological, environmental, that fuel the turbulence we are experiencing today. And of course, as we all know, many of the causes and consequences of this turbulence are transnational or even global in nature. And furthermore, I would argue that humankind now faces 3 simultaneous existential threats. The first being the climate crisis, the second, a new nuclear arms race, and the third, the advent of potentially hyper-disruptive technologies, some of which you've been studying this week, like AI, neuroscience, but also biotechnology. And these offer the promise of great good for humanity, but they also could create enormous peril. And here we are with this extraordinary turbulence occurring across the world, and yet the systems and institutions that we've relied on for global problem solving, or at least global problem management, since 1945 are clearly inadequate to the challenges of this century. They are inefficient, ineffective, non-adaptive, and in some cases, perhaps simply obsolete. We are operating with outmoded assumptions and anachronistic logic. And this is my key point of departure. The management theorist Peter Drucker observed in 1980 that the greatest danger in times of turbulence is not actually the turbulence itself. It's acting with yesterday's logic. And I think this is the central insight we need to bring to diplomacy in the decades ahead. Our institutions and the ways we engage in diplomacy must evolve, and evolve rapidly, toward a new logic, a 21st century logic that can guide us toward a more equitable distribution of resources, a sustainable planet, and far less violent conflict. And I'm going to just offer 5 guideposts for this transformation, summarize them very quickly. There's more detail in the paper. First, I think it's important that we actually adopt a new language, that we think about this collectively and contribute to it, and elucidate the principles that are part of a new logic. And they should recognize the reality of global interdependence and embrace multipolar pluralism. The era of great power domination must give way to a more equitable distribution of power. Second, the United Nations is still indispensable, as every one of the speakers has said, but we have to do the work of reimagining the United Nations for the 21st century. And I commend the UN and Secretary General Guterres in particular for organizing the Summit of the Future last September. It was an audacious undertaking. And while the results may not be all that any one of us might have hoped for, it's not an insignificant moment, and it's a moment that can be built on. We know that structural reforms are desperately needed, starting with the Security Council, but we can't just give up when we think, oh, it's impossible to do. We have to keep at it. We have to keep pushing. And as Elizabeth said, the current moment maybe has created a greater appetite for more ambition, and all of us can help push that ambition. We also have to think that in addition to the UN, we need to strengthen the ways that we can supplement the UN because it is so difficult to reform. And we've talked about regional cooperation. We've talked about polylateral networks, which I heartily endorse, and other ways to respond to global and regional problems in a way that is inclusive and effective. Third, and this is a tough one, we need to transform our conception of sovereignty. Sovereignty should not be a barrier to collective action, but rather a platform for collaborative governance. And here, of course, I just give enormous recognition to the European Union, a remarkable story of what has been accomplished by 27 member states over the history of the Union. As one French minister said, we must remember every day that the European Union is a miracle. And in some ways, it truly is. We have to think about how we can pool sovereignty, share sovereignty on issues like climate change, technology, public health, and while also devolving responsibilities and authority to lower levels of governance, cities, provinces, states, who are on the front lines of experiencing both the causes of turbulence and the consequences of turbulence, and need to be empowered and supported with resources to respond. Fourth, and this is all of you, we need to invest in a new generation of diplomats. The challenges that we face demand professionals trained in systems thinking and global understanding. With a large cohort of diplomats trained to represent both the interests of their countries and the global public good, we will vastly increase our capacity for collaborative problem solving. And I think this executive seminar on conflict resolution is an excellent example of the kind of learning experience and training experience and hands-on experience that will help diplomats become more effective in the age of turbulence. And fifth, and finally, we must embrace strategic empathy over strategic narcissism. In a divided world, the ability to understand others' perspectives, histories, and aspirations is not weakness, as somebody recently said. It's a necessity. True diplomacy is not domination through persuasion, but progress through shared understanding. The work of building a new international system fit for this age of turbulence is a daunting task. No question about it. And I don't presume to have the answers. I have some ideas that I've put out to stimulate debate and discussion. But I want to close with something Hannah Arendt once said. We are free to change the world and start something new in it. And to me, that's the task that is ahead of us. Thank you.
So much. Now, I would want to ask the panelists when they have, I was watching you, you've been listening carefully to what your fellow panelists were saying, and maybe you want to react to one point or another. Yeah.
Even analysis of at a very fundamental level, mind change, I think, is what you're advocating. Where does that start? Where do you see this germinating? I mean, yes, you're practitioners, but you know, there has to be some drive coming from somewhere. That do you see it coming from the UN or where?
I think it has to be a polylateral process, and I sincerely mean that. I think the Summit of the Future, as I said, was in essence an effort at the UN to begin to have that kind of a discussion. I think the previous panel focusing on the role of global civil society is absolutely critical, because I do think the mindset shift is more likely to come bottom up than it is from top down. It's going to come from people who are experiencing the turbulence in our world and know that we must have better solutions and better responses. I think it's going to be in universities and in think tanks, and it has to be polylateral. It's going to have to be, something that involves all of us over time. And the leadership, because of political constraints, because of their own histories, et cetera, are not likely to be the source of this change. They will, perhaps some of them follow quickly. We can hope that they will, but I think most of it is going to come at mid and lower levels and from outside the structures in global civil society and academia and think tanks.
Pascal, you raised your hand.
No, just to react to the very valid point that was made about the European Union. I agree that the main problem of any sort of proper international cooperation system is sovereignty, which is still the legal, ideological basis of the international system since 1648. That's correct. But, and I've been working a lot, and I'm still working a lot to try and foster European integration, which is a supranational, sovereignty-changing system. But I don't think there is much hope that this system is emulated elsewhere. Every time I've been looking at attempts to regional integration, cooperation, it hasn't worked. To be frank, most of the regional integration processes that have happened, and most of them started with the economic thing, are in bad shape, with some exceptions like ASEAN, for instance. Second, I believe that looking forward, we have to start from the principle that globalization will remain the model of a market capitalist system. And I think if we start from this premise that globalization will stay, then the sort of problem we need to address are much clearer than if we maintain a sort of conversation that this world is going to break down, market capitalism will fragment, and after all, maybe having an international system is less important, which is what we hear from some. So I think, and that's my sort of only substantial remark on what has been said, the assumption we should start from looking at how we can fix the problems we have is that this world will keep integrating, although not exactly the way it has. But if we take what's in the news, which is this attempt by the US president to destroy the international rules-based trading system, I believe it will not work. And that's something which I believe should orient the way we think about the future.
Yes, I'm going to try to be a little provocative because we're at risk of violent agreement across this panel, I think, in every time zone, and which is very heartening in some ways. But I also want to maybe pose some challenges to us, because I think, surely we need the kind of investment, Stephen, that you've described on every dimension in every society, in more productive politics, the fact that empathy, I mean, you were quoted about this, but that the idea that empathy has been demonized in some of our popular culture lately, described as the great weakness of Western civilization, is a very hard thing to confront, that there is a view that is not held by a small number of people that is true. So I think you're absolutely right, investing on the one hand in the conditions in which people cooperate, reach out their hand to neighbors, to strangers, et cetera, at the local level, national, international, is very important. To me, that feels like a long hold investment. It may pay off suddenly, but it may pay off for only a distant time in the future. And in the meantime, we confront the conditions we have today with obviously rising populism, rising appeal to national identity, not always in productive forms. And Kyung-wha, I was very struck also when you were describing kind of what the path is for Korea, you also talked about doubling down on your national identity, right? And so to me, there is, in a productive way, in a very positive way, I think there's a different problem with sovereignty here, that as much as we might wish to overcome it or pool it, or in a rational way, that makes sense if you look rationally at how you solve. Politically, I don't see how that happens. And so I'm very attracted, Pascal, to something you said about, I think if I understood you rightly, in a sense, a de minimis approach to solving collective action challenges. What is just enough protection of undersea cables? What is just enough of a threshold condition for certain collective challenges that we, this goes back to the Dag Hammarskjöld line, is the United Nations meant to deliver us to heaven or to save us from hell? And in conditions like the ones we face, I think we would all be well served in thinking sometimes about where there's an alignment of actual interest between the powerful and the less powerful, but particularly across the powerful, who singly among a handful of countries have the ability to basically answer those existential questions in the negative for all of us. So I think a little bit of thinking along those lines would be helpful. I mean, we worked, as some of you know, maybe you've had connections with the UN Foundation. Through your missions, we work with a lot of missions. We were very involved on many fronts in trying to push and support high ambition in the Summit for the Future. But I sometimes wonder if the concept around the Summit of the Future might have distracted us, because everything was in the Summit for the Future. Everything that mattered to everyone everywhere was in the Summit for the Future. And I think there's a degree to which that might actually take our eye off of some of the harder challenges and deals and agreements that need to be brokered, so that we at least put a floor underneath how bad this could get. And I agree, Pascal, I agree with you. There actually are a lot of successes on the multilateral front. We are very proud of some of our work on green shipping and the work around with the IMO, and you named many of them, and there are still others. But I think that doesn't take away the fundamental risk that we face as a world on some of these existential threats. So I just want to pose that as a bit of a challenge, maybe to the rest of the panel, kind of how you react to that observation.
Yes, I think China is in the discussions seems to be more like a problem, to panelists when they mention China instead of a constructive role or a solution to the disruption, to the disorder. That's quite, I think, quite unfortunate. It seems to me China has done quite a lot to, quite strategic, sympathetic to the current situation of the world disorder. I want to be to play a constructive role in stabilizing, the turbulent world. So under such circumstances, I think it's we advocate diplomacy in this turbulent world. So regarding diplomacy, I think more emphasis should be put on pragmatism and problem solving, instead of ideology, so authoritarianism, something like that. Actually, I think there's a quite big common ground between China and especially regarding the international order. opinions on international order between China and the European countries. Saying, the multipolarity, that was also the topic of the Munich Security, conference for this year. So why we think China is more like a problem in this turbulent world? I would like to hear colleagues' response to that. And secondly, Mr. Stephen has you didn't mention that in your talk, but I read very carefully about your report. You mentioned specifically the China-U.S. relationship and suggested to establish a China-U.S. secretariat. I'm curious about how to who should be included in that kind of secretary. So I would like to stop there. Thank you.
I want to open to the room as quickly as possible, but I mean, there was a specific question. Do you want to?
First, thank you very much, Professor Yu. And first, I don't think I even mentioned the word China in my remarks, and I certainly would not call out China as a source of the problem. My own experience in China, which goes back, well, my very first visit to China was in 1979. And I've been serving on the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development for the past 13 years, which is a very high-level Chinese government international advisory panel that is a very serious operation. And so I go to China quite frequently, and I actually see a lot of things happening in China that I agree can be part of the solutions and are part of the solutions to a lot of the issues we face. And Pascal referred to the Kunming biodiversity agreement, and that was a very important Chinese-led process. So that's my first point. I do not put China in the category of the problem. And in fact, I think the panel focused more on the United States being more in the lead of the problem these days. Second, to the question of the U.S.-China Secretariat, and very, very briefly, my point is that the U.S.-China relationship, obviously, is the most consequential bilateral relationship of the 21st century. And it is a difficult relationship. And we engage episodically, and we engage in narrow silos. And we don't engage on a broad range of issues day in and day out. And that's the idea of a secretariat, is actually to second public servants from the key ministries of both governments to sit together in a place like Geneva or Singapore, or some other neutral spot, and literally work together day to day on the variety of issues that are points of contention and the issues that are points of cooperation, and to develop ideas, to educate each other, and then to share these ideas back in our national capitals. And I know this is a very difficult thing to organize, and I've spoken about it in China. But what I was interested in was the reaction was, oh, no, this is a terrible idea. The reaction was very hard to do, but interesting. And one of the thoughts that emerged from those conversations that maybe this can start in more of a track 2 kind of basis, where there is a kind of a permanent group of Chinese scholars from major universities and think tanks meeting with a similar group from America on a really regular schedule with a broad agenda to develop ideas, to learn from each other, and to share thoughts with their governments.
I will now open it to, I see many hands, so.
I have the mic, so I guess I'll start. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. My name is Sarah. I work for the UN Secretariat here in Peace and Security. I had a couple of questions for you. The inevitable UN reform question about how do you see the UN and its member states renounce its privileges like veto power, or even for UN staff, there was this floated idea of diminishing salaries, for example. And it's kind of, it feels like shooting ourselves in the foot on either side. So why would we do that? Also coming back to existential crises, which you mentioned, it feels like we need to go through these existential crises to actually reform the international system. Otherwise, it feels like there's no incentive right now to do that. And I'm linking that to my second question about like a generational divide, and how do we inspire new generations to step up, I guess, because it feels right now that we're either paralyzed with fear about the current environment or dread, or just, yeah, it feels hopeless at times, I have to admit.
Let's collect a few questions so that, because I see there's so many questions, so that we can do justice, if not all, to as many as possible. Yeah.
I already have the mic, so I'm going next. Hello. Thank you so much. My name is Bastian. I work with the Secretariat as well. So reflection also on the UN would be, the hardware is all still there, but the software is hopelessly outdated. When you go through the halls of the UN at any single given day, you see the performance of multilateralism in action, which is actually a minor miracle that on any issue under the sun, you see member states haggling over compromise. But then the question in the end is what for, if less and less of it actually carries real action or consequence. And I don't mean to belittle the hard work of multilateralism, but we see it specifically in the Security Council, where even if compromises or consensus is reached, which is rare these days, then often it doesn't carry
so be as concise as you can. Understood. Because we are pressed for time, so go to the question right away.
So what in very concrete terms should happen in the short term? Charter review, conference, or move beyond the UN altogether?
Oh, maybe I'll go straight to the question. Chihiro, Japanese diplomat based here. And so what would be, I also feel powerful, empowered by the Madam Kang's perspective on regional, enhancing regional cooperation in Northeast Asia. So I'd like to hear from Madam Kang and maybe from Professor Yu on what would the shape of the possible regional institution be like in the future in Northeast Asia. And just for DJ Pascal Lamy, I started my career as a deputy or expert in the ministry. So ça m'a fait vraiment chaud au ma corps de listen to you here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Rawa. I'm a diplomat from Lebanon. Mr. Heintz, quick comment. You mentioned 3 challenges. I think I would like to add one at the top of your list. I think we should put there conflicts and wars. If I am a Ukrainian, I think I would want to end the war before thinking of climate change, while I recognize that climate is very important. And Monsieur Lamy, I wish I was as optimistic as you. You said this is not that bad. I think it is quite bad when we look at my region specifically. And I think the UN that was created to save the future generations from the scourge of war failed to do that in many places, particularly in Gaza. You mentioned that we should prioritize. What would be your priorities in that sense? Thank you so much.
Get ourselves too roped into this context of US-China strategic competition. It's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. But the world is so much larger. There are other countries with leverage and agency. And there are other countries without any agency and leverage. There are 193, is it still, member states who by charter demand equal say. And there's this fundamental deficit that is not equal, which is the Security Council. And that is the fundamental issue with the institution. Changing that has been tried over decades. It hasn't gone anywhere. And I frankly don't think it's going to happen. I think we just leave that aside and work to do delivery with the rest of the system. I worked in the UN system on human rights, humanitarian affairs, and I really feel that the real work of the UN is on the ground. for the most vulnerable people. And when you come back from the ground to headquarters in Geneva and UN, there's a sense of surrealness about what is going on in headquarters. So if, there's a real need for a fundamental change, for more effective delivery on the ground, especially at a time when the largest donor to that work on the ground is withdrawing. So the 20% cut, frankly, I don't think it's going to cut it. And so there has to be, something's got to give. Something really has got to give to preserve the utility, the value of the UN system, which is really, I think, at the ground level. I think Northeast Asia, actually there is a small secretariat, trilateral secretariat in sitting in Seoul, basically doing very little because the political will of the countries, the governments has not been strong to further promote this. So yes, there is a little bit of instrument already established, but that hasn't been utilized all that well. But I think given I think America basically saying we don't want to play a leadership role anymore. You take care of yourselves. Action, reaction. There has to be a reaction, and that reaction has to be stronger cooperation among the regions. I don't know how that's going to be played out, but I do know that there is strong political will on the part of the new government. The Chinese, I think China is now the host of the trilateral. As all of these governments process, it starts as the working level, ministerial level, and then comes to the summit level. And the outcome of that is really difficult negotiation leading to any kind of an agreement at that level. But I think we have an opportunity for some significant movement to bring the three countries together. The American will probably not like me saying this, but you have no choice when America is withdrawing from that leadership. I think the U.S., Korea, Japan relationship will also need to continue to build when our partner across the partnership, the alliance partnership is demanding more of us, being more transactional. And so the changing, I think America's change about its role, it just triggers a different kind of thinking across the alliance partnership, across regional partnership. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. The question was also addressed to you. Do you have any thoughts, comments?
Yes, I agree with Madam Kang's analysis regarding the China-Japan ROK trilateral, cooperation. That's important. But it's still needs to improving. The problem is Northeast Asia is a difficult place. So the bedrock for the security architecture in this region is still the US-led hub and spokes system, US-Japan Alliance and US-RK Alliance, and also the Camp David, agreement 2 years ago signed. And the alliance system usually, essentially is exclusive. So I think that's quite not in harmony with the inclusive, China, Japan, and ROK cooperation or regionalization. But now I think we have some windows of opportunity. So because of a strategic competition between the United States and China, and also the regime change in ROK recently, maybe the APEC will be held, a summit meeting will be held in ROK, I think, later this year. I hope the trilateral cooperation between ROK, China, and Japan could be improved in the future.
There was a question mentioning WTO. I think I've already given my view on that. the WTO will survive Mr. Trump. And if you look back at history, the US have always had a problem with trade. They were born out of a trade war. They had the War of Secession, which was a trade war. It's the only country on this planet that has had 3 major episodes of protectionism: McKinley, Smoot-Hawley, Trump. So there is an exception, which is the US in the trade system. And again, I do not believe that although they have consistently distanced themselves from the WTO starting in 2008, and step by step, they've gone out of the system, although they will not leave it formally for a variety of reasons, the WTO will, in my view, survive this big ordeal. On priorities, I remain of the view that the global priority #1 is climate, because this is the most existential threat, and it is a totally collective one. I'm not saying Ukraine is not a priority for us Europeans, but I have to acknowledge that 2/3 of the countries of this planet, of the population of this planet, do not care a damn about Ukraine. This is a reality which we Europeans have had to absorb, and I'm not sure it's yet absorbed. We had the shock of Russia invading Ukraine. We had the shock of Trump breaking somehow the transatlantic bridge. And we had the shock of realizing that, contrary to what we thought, the world did not have a problem with Russia invading Ukraine and China siding with Russia, which it does, even if its Chinese population is more or less convinced that China is neutral. This is not the reality. So we have to acknowledge this reality, and the priority today, I believe, remains climate, and which is why I've, in my initial remarks, I believe that strengthening our climate governance system is a priority. We have a very weak climate governance system because of a fundamental, by construct, lack of disciplines. We all agree that we should go to zero carbon at some stage, and that's great. But the way we do it, the rhythm, the timing, the instruments are not coordinated by the Paris Agreement, and this is a very serious issue. The position of the US is not helping, but I think this is one more area where we should try to keep building something which is binding, or at least more binding than the Paris Agreement, which is not really binding. And if we need to do that for the moment without the US, let's do it. At least this is an issue on which I believe Europe, China, Latin America, Africa agree.
I mean, I see that we are, we are over time. We can take 4 or 5 minutes, so 2-3 questions, but just 1-sentence questions, because we really need to end in 5-6 minutes at the latest. So, gentleman here. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm from the Turkish mission to the UN. First of all, I'd like to make a comment about Mr. Lamy's remarks just now. You mentioned that Trump broke the transatlantic bridge, but I wouldn't say he broke it. It's a dent. The transatlantic bridge is much more robust than that, in my honest opinion. Now, on to my question. Mr. Lamy, you also mentioned that to build a new system, rather than we should build a new system rather than fixing the old. Now, I want to draw your attention to the UN Security Council, and Mr. Heintz also mentioned as regards UN Security Council reform that no matter how impossible it seems, we should just keep on going at it. Wouldn't you also see this, in the words of Albert Einstein, just trying the same thing over and over again and expecting different results? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Akira from the United Nations, but originally from Japanese Ministry of Defense. I have an experience of over 10 years in the Japanese government. So I know that the government official also, even passionate of the global issues, the member states sometimes have different views and sometimes change the political diplomatic direction, and the UN is impartial. So that's why that sometimes the difficulties, complexities, and tension sometimes happens. So just my question is, considering the future international system, what are better ways to build stronger partnership between the member states and international organizations overcoming such challenges?
Yes, very quickly. Amelie with the EU delegation to the UN.
Closer to the microphone, yeah.
So my question is more about the hardware that we mentioned earlier, the rules-based order. I think we know the why, but my question is more about the how. I think a lot of us were part of the Pact for the Future negotiations last year, and for us setting up a system where the US was not necessarily playing by the rules there and has not also in history always been playing by the rules that they actually also helped set up, sets us all on a bit of a back footing. And so my question is a little bit more about, do you think we need to rethink something fundamental about this rules-based order, rethink kind of going back to the charter question, and who do you need us here in the room from? So UN Secretariat, member states, civil society, who needs to play a big role in this?
Okay, so you've heard the question. I'm going to ask the panelists to each give their thoughts on one question or an issue that they care about as a sort of final comment. Let's start with you, Elizabeth.
It's very hard. Great and important question. So I think to wrap up a few of them, UN reform is absolutely fundamental, but I would put it more in a reimagining. It really needs to be a deep reinvention. I think that bridges both the first question of the first round and this last question, which to my mind has to go with building some kind of alignment around an understanding of what my phrase is the core of the core is of what value the UN system delivers to the breadth of member states and their citizenries. I tend to locate that myself in this core proposition of peace, as well as a subset of global public goods collective action challenges that truly need every single country to be able to solve them. And particularly for smaller countries, really needs a system that can deliver in an equitable fashion for them. I think we get a little distracted with Security Council reform, as absolutely important as it is, as massively overdue as it is, no question about it. I have my own form. We all have our own ways that we would solve this problem. But at the same time, and obviously none of them have worked, but I think at the same time, there has been important innovation across the UN system that actually is kind of a countervailing factor. Everything from the veto initiative to the GA stepping up in various contexts to assert its privileges. I think there is much more that can happen in the General Assembly context than both on peace and broader issues. I hope doesn't upset people, but to me, one of the most bracing things to happen in the last couple of years at the UN was a vote on tax cooperation that was brought to the General Assembly by the Africa Group after years of frustration with sluggish developments at the OECD. It was a very divisive vote, self-evidently. I mean, and that was tough, but it was countries bringing the issues that mattered the most to them to the UN. There could kind of be a more, practical illustration of the relevance of the UN system to the issues that matter the most to countries around the world. So to me, as much as that was, a sense of fight, it was the right kind of thing to be fighting about and the right kind of thing to be wrestling through, because countries don't all agree. They have very different interests. That's the whole point of the UN, is that it is not to, if we all agreed, we really wouldn't need the United Nations, right? I mean, it really is a forum to try to resolve our toughest challenges, even if it's just taking the sharpest edges off of those at a time of tremendous global challenge. So I will just end with that and say, thank you to all of you in advance, because I know you're going to fix things over this critical next year of diplomacy at the UN. Thanks.
Thank you. And Heintz.
Well, I'm glad that Elizabeth talked about the UN Security Council reform. So because I agree with her, I won't spend much time on that. I just don't think we can ignore it, but we shouldn't be obsessed with it either. We need to work on a lot of other things at the same time. I want to add a dimension here that gets to the question about the rules-based international order. One of the little mini chapters in my paper is about the need for transformed US global leadership. And I think that's a responsibility of we Americans. We need to be injecting these concerns into the public discourse in our country, into the political debate. That's going to be a hard thing to do, but this is one area where I think there are some emerging signals from some key leaders in the opposition party in the United States who are seriously rethinking all of this and feel very much the way some of the sentiments in this room have been expressed about a history of US hypocrisy, a history of the US actually violating the UN Charter, and seeing the consequences of that play out in real time in 2025. So I think this is a hugely important part of it, and we Americans really have to take this task on. Yeah.
Okay. Just to reinforce Pascal's point about how the climate crisis being, and if the U.S. federal administration has opted out, that doesn't mean the rest of the United States has opted out. The states, industry, I think the green transition has left. The bus has left. It's happening, and we just need to do all of our effort, all countries, all government. I think China has just peaked its emission this year, way ahead of the target year. So China's leadership is extremely important, and we would like to press China to do more. Yeah, there's still lots of coal power plants being built, and that's a huge point of criticism from climate activists. So we really need to nail down on every government, not only delivering on their commitments already, but making those ambitions more ambitions. I don't think many governments has submitted their renewed national determined carbon. It's really, I mean, the future of humanity depends on it. And so I would only, for whatever your field is, I think that climate dimension has to be really integrated into all of your work. Thank you.
Professor Yu.
Yes. Yes, the United Nations is facing a lot of challenges now, especially facing so much of disruptions, and it should play a more important role, but it cannot. I think for UN to function well, yes, every country has their responsibility, especially those major country or Security Council members, including China. But at the current stage, the United States seem to be more unilateral. So for UN to function well, I think we need to coordinate and do the required reform. But anyway, I think it's the United Nations is indispensable. It's the backbone of global governance. It will be worse. The world will get worse without the United Nations, I believe. So we need to do more for strengthening it. That's my word.
Pascal.
Two short points. One, I agree with Elizabeth that if something has to be rebased in the global multilateral UN-like system, it's a declaration of values. And this should be a sort of basement. It will take a bit of time, and the result will not be the one we had with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It will be different. How different is too long to enter into. Second, if multilateralism does not work or does not work enough, try plurilateralism and polylateralism. There are lots of international animals other than sovereigns that are ready to engage in international cooperation because they need it for their own interest. So we have, in a way, to go beyond the Westphalian system to find new solutions to new problems. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I mean, I'm a very bad timekeeper because I see that once again, we have gone over time, but I think it was well worth it. I apologize to Jeffrey Rosen, who arrived early, and so it will delay by a few minutes our conversation, but I want to thank all the panelists for their contribution to what was a very rich conversation. Thank you.